Many people are stepping through life believing that their story will always hold them back in some way. And I can totally relate because I have been there too, believe me. What I wish I had in those moments was a reference point, someone or something to help me believe that even the darkest parts of my story was shaping me into the person I was always meant to be. Nowadays, as a international speaker, entrepreneur, and husband to the most amazing woman, I've made it my mission to help you own your story so that you can live a life of impact, influence, and inspiration. I'm Winston Ben Clements, and this is Born to Win. Okay, I'm gonna be completely honest with you, completely transparent. This is episode 4 of the Born to Win podcast, and I'll be honest, let's just say we should have a lot more episodes released by now, because I first had the idea of launching this podcast a very, very long time ago. And yeah, because of one thing or another, and I'm gonna talk about it in this episode, I just didn't follow that intention as early as I could have, right? And it's a shame because I think we're so blessed to have the technology nowadays to be able to reach so many people in such a easily accessible way, literally global reach for content creators. Um, and I just think it's such a cool legacy to be able to leave behind. I mean, my brain would have exploded with joy if there was a way for me to access to receive wisdom from just people, previous generations, people that we read about in the history books, your Martin Luther Kings, your Malcolm X's, your anyone who inspires you, being able to hear from them on a weekly podcast would have been a game changer for me. And not even those historic figures, even people like my grandparents or my great grandparents, having their wisdom and their thoughts recorded somewhere would have been super cool thing to have, right? And and so knowing all this and also having a passion for storytelling, why did I not start sooner? And truthfully, a big part of it was just good old procrastination. I just didn't make the time to do it. And, when you don't make the time to do something, it will just keep getting pushed further and further back because it's not, they say where your attention flows, your energy goes, right? My attention, for a while was not on this podcast. And so I didn't put any energy, I didn't put any effort into creating it. And another thing maybe that sort of slowed me down as well was maybe, if I'm honest again, maybe a bit of imposter syndrome. So, you know, this gets talked a lot about in the personal development world. Everyone's talking about imposter syndrome. And, for me, I listen to podcasts. I listen to a lot of different podcast platforms. It's actually one of my favorite hobbies to do. And I guess, and this is me being like really vulnerable, I guess on some level, I didn't feel like I was ready to launch my own podcast because I didn't know if I could live up to all the amazing, podcast platforms that I follow, that I listen to. And it sounds crazy because this is coming from me, being blessed to work as an international speaker. I've done TED Talks. I've spoken on big stages, including Google. I spoke at Google last week, so I've really been on those big platforms. But I guess this is a lesson to show here that it doesn't matter where you get to on your journey. There will always be moments where you feel a bit of imposter syndrome, and that's how I felt with this podcast for some reason, right? And and yeah, so one thing that's come to mind just now actually is, my wife and I, we run a monthly masterclass called Talk Less Do More, TLDM for short, where we actually the main purpose of that group is to help aspiring entrepreneurs to stop playing small, and to actually start stepping into their purpose. And I'll drop the link in the show notes for anyone who might be interested in learning more about that. But the reason why I brought that up was because a lot of the people that we work with in that group, or that we've worked with previously, um, I guess they would define themselves as creators, right? People who yeah, they're just creators of content. They're people with a lot of ideas. And the reason why I mention it is because I share a lot of similarities with that group. Because I can get into a place where I have so many ideas, but I don't always have the same intensity of execution. Um, and so in today's episode, it's gonna be pretty straightforward, but I just felt that, this might be, in a time when, we're in lockdown, we're out of lockdown, and maybe perhaps in a year where people are finding themselves with a little bit more time than usual, and which is good, but with that it also brings the pressure to create, because everyone's asking, so what did you do during lockdown, or how did you spend the extra time? And by the way, you don't even need to feel the pressure to create during this time, but for those of you who have so many ideas, but you get into a bit of a rut when it comes to creating, I just wanted to share some tips. I think I'll share 3 tips to hopefully give you some momentum towards that thing, or that project that you've been talking about for years and years, or that thing that you said you were going to do during lockdown, but you still haven't got around to it yet. So I'm going to share with you some ideas that have helped me build some momentum around my projects, and come out of this situation where I just kind of get overwhelmed and end up not doing much. So let's just jump straight into it. So the first tip that's really helped me is, it's by creating an MVP. And let me just explain what that is. So a this is a concept that I first came across when I worked in full-time corporate as a software engineer. So I was working in a technology role for a big corporate organization. And MVP simply stands for minimum viable product, right? And honestly, all it means is just creating a very basic or reduced version of the thing that you are ultimately trying to build. So if the thing that you're trying to do or to build is to write a book, let's say, an MVP could look like, as a starting point, just write down the chapters of your book. That is it. Just write down just the chapters of your book. Or if your big goal is to speak in front of large audiences, thousands of people or hundreds of people, then just start by giving talks to a handful of people. Maybe even just your close friends, or your family. And for me, this MVP concept, I think it's such a hack, because I find personally, and you guys can reach out to me and tell me if you can relate to this, but for me, the biggest blocker, the biggest resistance comes in starting a big task, right? And once I've taken a few small steps, in the right direction, once I've made a start, then all of a sudden I have momentum. And, this thing that seems so huge and so scary, it becomes easier to, just to see progress towards it, right? And for me, the MVP idea, in a way, it basically helps me trick myself out of overwhelm, trick myself out of freezing, out of becoming, falling into analysis paralysis because this huge project that I want to work on just seems too big and scary. So the MVP allows me just to do one little thing towards it, which then allows me to build momentum towards the bigger ultimate goal. So MVP, try it out. The second thing that I would suggest, to kind of get yourself out of this rut, if you've ever had this experience, is just to make it fun. Honestly, make the thing that you're doing fun. And by this, what I mean is, and I'm one of those people that needs to enjoy their work. I'm not gonna lie, I struggle when work is not interesting for me, or when it's difficult, when it's boring. I just, yeah, it just becomes really, really painful. It's like pulling teeth. And I suspect I'm not the only one. I suspect that you're the same too, right? And so for me, what I've started to build an awareness of is that when a task starts to appear even a little bit boring or a little bit challenging, um, I just know there's a chance it will never get done. Honestly, if I'm truly honest with myself, I know there's a good chance that I'm just never gonna attempt this thing. Um, and and of course we talk about, you know, resilience, and we talk about, never giving up and all of these things. But I think there's a fine balance between, never giving up and being resilient, and also just knowing what your zones of genius are, right? And so for me, a good example of this is, when it came to this podcast, to put together a podcast, there's different, I guess you could call them pieces or artifacts that you need to create, right? And there's obviously the recording, which is what you're listening to right now, but there's also all the branding stuff, all the images, all the social media content, all of these things that help promote the podcast and help create an awareness of it, right? Usually images or short videos to promote the podcast, all of those things, right? And so, back to what I love to do. I love to speak. I love to motivate. I love to inspire you to unleash your full potential. So that part I enjoy. But I can't say I feel the same way about spending hours and hours playing around um, with Canva or some other photo editing or video editing software. So what do? I outsource that stuff. I outsource that stuff because it's not in my zone of genius. It's just not fun for me, right? And when I outsource it, this allows me to actually focus my attention, my energy on the good stuff, the stuff that I really want to do, which is, recording, my ideas, my thoughts, and these episodes for you. And I think, honestly, in fact, I think I have to do a whole episode on outsourcing some other time, because I've seen so many people, particularly in business or even entrepreneurs, people get stuck in a rut, just trying to figure out things that will take someone else 5 minutes to do. Honestly, it will take somebody else 5 minutes to do. And for me, that is unhelpful resilience. When you're banging your head against a brick wall, um, when you should actually be focusing on the thing that comes easily to you, the thing that is within your zone of genius, the thing that is within your gifts and your talents. So I am gonna do, I think, or let me know if you think doing a separate episode on outsourcing and systemizing um your processes would be useful, right? So that's the second tip. Make it fun. Focus on the bits that are within your zone of genius. Everything else you should consider handing off to someone else, somebody whose zone of genius it is. Because there are people out there, and I'm fortunate to have someone to help me with my branding, because that is her zone of genius, and so we both get to operate in our zone of genius, and overall the project gets done quicker. The podcast gets released, and it looks good because I I'm in my zone of genius, and so is my colleague who's doing the branding, right? So anyway, enough about that. So the final tip, um, around getting out of procrastination, stepping out of overwhelm. The final tip I'm gonna share today is I think I'm gonna share on counting the cost of not doing it. All right. So yeah, counting the cost of not doing the thing. So, and let me go back to the podcast. So for me, the cost of not doing this podcast, if I really sit down and reflect and think about it, the cost of not doing it is that my nephews, my nieces, my children, my grandchildren, all my future generations, they, if I don't do it, they would miss out on the opportunity to learn from me, from my challenges, from my mistakes, my lessons, my experiences, right? And likewise for you, if you don't write that book, if you don't release that song, or if you don't follow through and speak on that stage, then what is the cost? Who is going to miss out, right? And for me, thinking about that is always a wake up call, because tomorrow is not guaranteed for anyone, right? And so this is another technique that I use to trick myself out of procrastination, counting the cost, remembering, almost reconnecting to my mortality, which sounds a little bit dark and gloomy, but it's a wake up call that helps me just step out of those moments when I'm just dragging my feet on something that I know is connected to my purpose, right? And that is it. That is pretty much it for today. All I wanted to do was share with you my 3 tips, my quick tips for getting, um, my tips and recommendations for getting yourself out of a rut, out of procrastination, out of overwhelm, because it is an easy trap to fall into, and we all experience it, even me, from time to time. And and maybe just a quick recap. So, 3 tips. The first one was to just create that MVP. Consider creating that simple version of, the ultimate thing that you're trying to build, just to give yourself some momentum. The second tip was to make it fun. Find a way to focus on the bits that you enjoy, the bits that are within your gift set, your talents. And also consider outsourcing the rest to an expert. You don't have to do it all. And as I mentioned, I might do a separate episode on this piece, um, how to outsource, and how to know which bits you should be outsourcing, so that you're not constantly banging your head against the wall, right? And the third little tip was just to write down the cost of not doing the thing, right? And this could be from a personal perspective, a professional, health, relationship perspective. What is the cost of not taking the action today? Bearing in mind, nobody is guaranteed tomorrow. And so, thank you as always for joining me here today, and for choosing to own your story, so that you can live a life of impact, influence, and inspiration. And also a massive appreciation for those who followed the Born to Win podcast on across our social media platforms. And if you'd like to join our community of winners, check out the links for the social media platforms. I'm going to drop it in the show notes below. And I think that's it. So have a wonderful day, whatever you're doing. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. And by the way, if you're listening on Spotify, Apple, or some other kind of app, and you got some value from today's episode, then I'd absolutely love if you could drop me a quick review. Until next time.